Welcome to Hard Chat, the protest edition. With me is Professor Sarah Joseph, Director of the Castan Centre for Human Rights Law. Nice jacket, by the way.
I know. Thanks, Maria.
That's okay. Now, Sarah, you're here to talk to us about protest.
That's correct.
Yes, and we've got our little signs. Make love, not war.
Give peace a chance.
Hers is better.
She made them all.
Now, Sarah, on to more serious matters.
Mm-hmm.
When people think of protest, they think of the big protests we see in the street.
Yeah, marches and
marches, etc. But now you're across social media.
Mm-hmm.
You're a social media icon. Can I say that?
Thank you.
Thank you. So, can you discuss the different sorts of protests happening around the world, and what form do protests now take that might have been different to
Well,
years ago?
I think protest has always taken many different forms. You mentioned the marches and the demonstrations. There's also sit-ins and occupations have made a bit of a comeback recently, especially with the Occupy movement, which raises really interesting issues from human rights. You can talk about freedom of assembly, which is a right to assemble and demonstrate. There's a question of how long you can assemble for. Does assembly include camping in the middle of the city and occupying it for quite a long time, which is what the Occupy movement did, and also the Arab Spring, when they occupied certain iconic sites in Cairo and other cities. So you have protests like that. You also have protests in different contexts. You mentioned social media. Hashtags themselves can be protests.
That's true. Yeah, bring them here
Bring them here is part of it. It's online, and there are people who question how effective that is compared to, say, an actual physical presence. But it is also something that enables people to get much more involved for a longer period of time. I think a really interesting thing for people to talk about today, that is the 2nd of June, and when I'm not with you, is issues to do with protest in a less public context. Like, to what extent can you protest at work? By wearing, say, and I'm not talking about protesting about your work. Yeah. I think one aspect of protest probably is, protesting about something that's a little bit beyond yourself and your own situation. And so, but for example, a few people a few weeks ago wearing those refugee T-shirts at work, or people wearing refugee T-shirts as teachers. And so,
do you think there's a problem in that? We'll get to that later, but do you think you are trespassing into, if I turn up to administrative law and people may not totally agree with the position that I'm, whether it's refugees or whatever it is there a point at which you say, well that's making me feel uncomfortable, or that's a political stance that I don't want to see in my lecturer?
I'm pretty pro free speech, so I don't actually have a problem with it. But yeah, I can see that there are contexts where, look, from a human rights context, it is much more difficult to establish a right to protest at work as opposed to just a right to protest on the street and something like that. I would feel very uncomfortable saying you couldn't do that as a lecturer. I would hope that our students are robust enough to be able to cope with a lecturer making a political statement. I suppose it gets a little closer to the bone when you're talking about teachers, because you're talking about much younger kids. And whilst we might, I suspect everyone in the room is very comfortable with a pro-refugee message, there's other messages that can be in protest.
Exactly.
And there is always a tendency with protest to assume that it's progressive and to assume it's even somewhat radical. It can go both ways. And so one interesting legal question, which I can park for now, is the issue of protest in that private context, at work and so on. Another one would be protest and counter-protest, and the good example of this would be the fascist protests, I can't remember the names of the parties, Reclaim Australia, that whenever they want to have a march or a protest, there's often a counter anti-racist protest. And the police get involved because they feel they have to keep the two groups apart, otherwise there's going to be a big fight. And so I think people have to consider today that whatever you're going to conclude about the right to protest, it logically has to extend to almost all political opinions. Maybe not hate itself, but there's a lot of opinions I think we wouldn't agree with, which fall short of hate. And so, the Reclaim Australia issue is an example of that. And then any right to counter-protest. There is a right to counter-protest, but it does fall short of violence. And I guess when you have protests and counter-protests, violence is something that can happen. And then another aspect of protest would be certain people protesting. I'm thinking here of there's been sports people who have protested. David Pocock from the rugby union chained himself, and that's another.
Okay.
He chained himself, I think, to some sort of bulldozer as part of environmental protest, and did get arrested for civil disobedience, and intended to be arrested. And this is, sometimes civil disobedience, in fact, involves, being prepared to not necessarily go to jail. He didn't go to jail, but get arrested. But then he got upbraided by the Australian Rugby Union because part of his contract involves, being a good role model and things like that. So there are issues which aren't directly about protest, but related, if you like, to one's ability to engage in protest. I mentioned there what David Pocock did, which was chain himself to, I think it was a bulldozer or some sort of piece of apparatus. I guess a lot of protests can involve that sort of thing, and therefore cross a line into things which actually are illegal. But, there are often people prepared to pay that price, that's the best way of getting the message across. Just two more examples of types of protest. You can have the guy a few years ago who sent out that fake ANZ cable about... I guess about banks funding coal mines and things like that. I mean, that was a very interesting protest and did lead to the short-term tanking of the share price of that particular coal mine. Fun fact is, I think its price now is even lower, and it's got nothing to do with him. So that's an interesting type of protest, like a very clever type of protest. And one of my favourites related to cleverness is groups like the Yes Men. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Yes Men, but they're, I think they call themselves culture jammers, and they often will engage in protests against various aspects of globalisation, but will do things such as impersonate people from the WTO, turn up at conferences and pretend they're from the WTO and say absolutely outrageous trade policies which no one actually notices is wrong, and will just clap politely. I think their most famous stunt is they turned up on maybe Channel 4 in Britain, so quite a high profile media outlet, and one of them pretended to be from Dow Chemical and promptly announced that Dow Chemical was, after all these years, going to compensate all the people from Bhopal.
I remember that.
And the sad fact is that caused Dow's share price to tank, which is...
which means they can't pay the compensation?
No, but it doesn't say a lot about human nature, about, you're going to do something good, so we'll sell.
Right, yeah.
But I suppose it rose fairly quickly once people established that it was bullshit. But I suppose more of a problem was the false hope, or the very temporary false hope it might have given people in Bhopal. But the people who did it, the Yes Men themselves, then went and visited Bhopal, and at least from the footage they've got, people were pretty happy they did it. They were sort of like, stuff Dow Chemicals, and we're glad that you gave them a temporary black eye. Yeah.
Excellent.
I mean, it certainly brought a lot of attention to the issue, which is, I guess, one of the intentions of protest.
I guess, what about the issue of damage, though?
Damage, as
a result of the...
Well, I mean, that's something that you're going to discuss today. How much damage is worth it? I think the Dow price. I mean, the damage to Dow was actually fleeting. I suppose there could be shareholders who sold on that. They're more likely to have been institutional shareholders, and given their range of shareholdings, I would suspect that the actual damage to them was pretty low. Then you hear about mums and dad shareholders who probably knew nothing about it until it was all over. So, I don't actually know what a mum and dad shareholder is. I guess a shareholder who's a mum or a dad. Apparently they're better than all of us.
Now, this is a big question. Are you ready for it?
Another big question.
This is a big question.
It's okay, I've got my jacket.
Good. Is there a human right to protest?
Yes.
Because of freedom of assembly, freedom of expression.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of human rights which are relevant to protest. Freedom of expression is probably the most obvious one.
Mm-hmm.
Freedom of assembly, if your protest should take the form of an assembly, but if it's a hashtag or something like that, then you're in the realm of freedom of expression. Freedom of expression still has some application in a in a private environment like a workplace, but it has a slightly, well, in fact, a pretty different form and is subject to more limitations. But those are the two rights which immediately spring to mind. I mean, I guess given the type of protest that might be involved, it might, it could involve other rights, but those are the two main rights, I would say.
And has the Human Rights Council ever come, they address this in any declarations, or have they addressed the actual right to protest? I know they would have addressed freedom of assembly, etc., but
I don't know if there's a resolution on protest itself by the Human Rights Council. There would probably be a lot of countries on the Human Rights Council that don't really want to do that.
yes.
But there are definitely resolutions about freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, and a special rapporteur on freedom of assembly and association has been established in the last 5 years. And I think probably as I'm not 100% sure, but maybe as a direct result of the Arab Spring and the Occupy movement and so on. So they're paying more attention, and those reports would definitely address issues regarding protest.
Now, the last question, because you're the Twitter queen.
Thank you.
Thank you. With a good jacket. What particular issues do you see arising from the use of social media and other technology in the context of protest? Now, we've talked about hashtags, but are there any other issues that you think might...
I mean, it's important not to assume that social media fundamentally changes things. It's just a tool. And it can be a good or a bad tool. It's not, of itself, good or bad. It depends on how it's used. It can be, I guess, yes, a platform for protest itself, including hashtags and so on. But it's also, I think, one of the biggest effects it's had on protest is as an organising tool. So as a way, for example, of finding like-minded people and realising, hey, there's a lot of people who feel aggrieved about this issue, so let's get together and maybe start some sort of movement. So it's a way of finding out that other people exist, and much more broad spectrum than, the old ways of communicating. And for an actual protest, and say particularly, I guess this is probably focusing on the traditional march and demonstration and so on, it's a great way of organising them. Like, hi, we're going to be at this point in time, we're going to be at, this street corner at this point in time, come along. And so it's a much easier way of getting to a lot of people very quickly. I mean, Dr. Dastiari used this for her, for the protests which were at Flinders Station every Friday. So it's a great organising tool. I'm imagining that during protests it can also be a way of communicating with each other and saying, hey, the police are here or whatever. That depends if the protest should, I guess if the police start to get involved and you really need to have to contact people, that's when the protest is starting to get a bit awry. I mean, famously, social media definitely made a difference in the Arab Spring. It was a way of galvanising people, and it was a way of organising people. And it probably ensured that more people got out on the street than would have. It's also a way, I suppose, of bypassing government-controlled media like the radio and TV, especially in places where it is controlled by the government. But then in the London riots, so not protests but riots, social media was defamed a bit because I think David Cameron came out and blamed Twitter that this was a way of getting around the police and therefore organising the riots. And it turned out that in fact Twitter probably played a bigger role with hashtag clean it up or hashtag tidy up, which happened after the riots. And I think it was more BlackBerry for some reason. I've never had a BlackBerry, but BlackBerry,
the passe.
Who has BlackBerry anymore?
No one.
But it was, I think BlackBerry for some reason was quite complicit in the London riots.
Right, very good. Now in closing, to end hard chat, the protest edition.
It wasn't that hard, mate.
We chatted hard.
Right.
Would you like to tell us anything about protest? Would you like to protest anything?
And
no, any closing?
Well, I can just say that right now I'm probably sitting in Vienna or Budapest and probably don't have anything to protest really much. I'll have to jump on a plane tomorrow. I could protest that.
Definitely. Yeah. So, to end, make love.
Chatting hard.
Not war. Chatting hard.
Give peace
hard
a chance.
Chat.